Good day, guys. I'm still on a series of excitable tissues physiology. Today, I think we'll be classifying neurons, okay? Because these neurons, excitable physiology excitable tissues is all about neurons and what muscle, okay? So on this, we'll be talking about the classification of neurons, and we say that there's a structural classification of neurons, right? So this is classification based on the relationship of dendrites to the cell body and the axons, okay? This is where we have the anasonic neurons, and these are small and have no anatomical clues to distinguish the dendrites from the axons, right? These are anasonic neurons. So all the processes look alike. So anasonic cells, neurons are located in the brain and in special sense organs. Their functions are poorly understood. Okay, the unipolar neuron and the pseudo-unipolar neuron. A neuron from which only a single process leaves the body. Okay, so this single process then divides close to the cell body into a trunk to supply the branching dendrite for incoming signals and an axon for outgoing signals, right? So for the record, this is an anasonic neuron. You can see from here, you can't really say which one is a dendrite, which one is an axon, okay? Then now we are on the pseudo-unipolar. Yeah. This is a pseudo-unipolar, right? So let's go back, guys. So we said that the pseudo-unipolar, it has only one process, okay, with a cell body in the middle, and this single process divides close to the cell body into the trunk, right, to supply the branching dendrite for incoming signals and an axon for outgoing signals. And the unipolar neurons are what typically sensory neurons, okay, with the receptors located within the skin, joints, muscles, and internal organs. And their axons are usually long, terminating in the spinal cord, okay. So how about the bipolar neurons? We say that the good example of the bipolar neuron, it's a bipolar neuron. Okay, sorry, it's a bipolar neuron. Okay, so the bipolar neuron, you see that a neuron from which two processes leave the cell body. The dendritic tree emerges from one end of the cell body, while the axon emerges from the opposite side. So the dendritic branching is typically limited and the axons are usually short in length. So the bipolar neurons are often sensory neurons associated with what? Receptor organs of the visual and auditory systems. The narrow field created by the short dendrites of these neurons underlie the concise encoding of the visual and the auditory information. So without this narrow encoding of sensory information, the resolution of vision and hearing will be reduced. So they are smaller than the unipolar or the multipolar neurons. The largest measure less than was 30 millimeters from end to end, okay? Then about the multipolar neuron. This is a multipolar neuron. I think these are the most common neurons that we have. This is a neuron from which multiple branches leave the cell body. The main dendrites of the multipolar neuron allows for extensive integration of information coming from many other neurons. The axons are usually long, allowing this integration information to affect distant regions of the nervous system. The majority of the neurons are multipolar. So their axons can be as long as those of the unipolar neuron. Now that was the structural classification of neurons. Let's go on the functional classification of neurons, right? So functional classification, we have the sensory neurons. These are the sensory neurons. Sensory neurons, I think these are the ones that are sensing, all right, passing to the interneuron, then from the interneuron to the central nervous system, then the central nervous system sends the information out, all right, using the motor neurons. So sensory neurons, these are the afferent, okay? They take information from the outside to the CNS. So a sensory neuron is a neuron conducting sensory information from a receptor cell or organ in the form of nerve impulses toward the nerve centers in the brain or spinal cord. Okay, so somatic sensory neurons monitor the outside world and our position within it, and the visceral sensory neurons monitor internal conditions and the status of the organ. Then the motor neurons, these are the efferent neurons, taking information away from the CNS. Okay, so a neuron which conveys impulses outward from the central nervous system to regulate the action of a muscle, gland, and other effective tissue. Okay, functional types of neurons. Then we have the interneuron, which is an association neuron. And the interneuron is a nerve cell found entirely within the central nervous system that acts as a link between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons, okay, or connects with other interneurons in a network or pathway within the central nervous system. Right now, they are responsible for the distribution of sensory information and the coordination of motor activity. So, for example, one or more interneurons are usually situated between sensory neurons and the motor neurons. So the interneurons, they are like mediating between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons. Okay, so the more complex the response is to a given stimulus, the greater the number of interneurons involved. Okay, so interneurons are also involved with higher functions such as memory. You need to think so much, so there are so much interneurons in your brain, planning and learning. Okay, every complex activity will have so many interneurons in between the sensory and the motor neurons involved in it. So there will be classification based on axon length. In axon length, we say that neurons are divided into Golgi type 1 neurons. These are neurons that have long axons that extend from one part of the brain to the other. Examples are pyramidal cells, Purkinje cells, anterior horn cells. Okay. Then how about the Golgi type 2 neurons? These are the neurons that have short axons that do not extend beyond the vicinity of the cell body. Example is the granule cell. Okay. Then there's also classification of nerves based on neurotransmitter. I would say that a neuron affects other neurons by releasing a neurotransmitter that bind to chemical receptors. Now, the effect on the postsynaptic neuron is determined by the type of receptor that is activated. Either is it inhibitory, is it excitatory. In principle, a single neuron releasing a single neurotransmitter can have excitatory effect on some targets, inhibitory effect on others, and modulatory effect on others. So let me explain this point. A neurotransmitter can be excitatory on some targets. Okay, the neurotransmitter can be inhibitory on others and modulatory on others. Okay, so the two most common neurotransmitters in the brain include glutamate and GABA. And their actions are largely consistent. Glutamate acts on several different types of receptors and have effects that are excitatory at ionotropic receptor and modulatory at metabotropic receptor. So similarly, GABA acts on several different types of receptors, but all of them have effects in adult animals at least that are inhibitory. So because of this consistency, it is common for neuroscientists to simplify the terminology by referring to cells that release glutamate as excitatory neurons. Okay, now the cells that release GABA as inhibitory neurons. So since over 90% of the neurons in the brain release either glutamate or GABA, this label encompasses the great majority of neurons. Okay, so there are also types of neurons that have consistent effects on their target. For example, excitatory, that's our motor neurons in the spinal cord that release acetylcholine, and inhibitory spinal neurons that release glycine. Okay, so these are just classification of nerves structurally. So neurons differ in type of neurotransmitter they manufacture. Some examples are cholinergic neurons, that's the acetylcholine. The acetylcholine is released from the presynaptic neurons into the synaptic clefts. It acts on the muscarinic receptors and nicotinic receptors. How about the GABAergic neurons? That's a gamma aminobutyric acid. The GABA is one of the two inhibitors in the CNS, the other being glycine. So GABA activates anion channels that allow chlorine ion to enter the postsynaptic neurons. So how the glutamatergic neurons? That's the glutamate. So glutamate is one of the two primary excitatory amino acid, the other being aspartate. Okay. So how about dopaminergic neurons? They release dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that acts on D1 type, D5 and D1 and D5 receptors, and D2 type, that's a D2, D3 and D4 receptors. So dopamine is connected to mood and behavior and modulates what pre and post synaptic neurotransmission. So loss of dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra has been linked to what Parkinson's disease. I have a video on Parkinson's disease. If you want to watch it, just comment on this video that you want to watch a video on Parkinson's and I'll drop it. Then how about the serotonergic neurons? This is serotonin. It's also known as a 5-hydroxytryptamine. And this can act as what excitatory or inhibitory. So a lack of what hydroxytryptamine at postsynaptic neurons has been linked to what depression. Okay. So there's subclassification of nerve fibers based on diameter. We said that nerve conduction velocities are specific to each individual and largely depends on the axon diameter. The degree to which the axon is myelinated, the greater the diameter of a given fiber. Okay, so the degree to which the axon is myelinated, the greater the diameter of the nerve fiber, the greater the speed of conduction. So the larger axons are concerned primarily with what proprioception, sensation, somatic motor function, conscious touch, pressure, while the smaller axons subserve pain and temperature sensation and autonomic functions. Okay, so this is just a table showing sensory fibers and also motor fibers. Okay, there are Elanga-Gasser classification, the diameter microns, the velocity, and the functions, right? I don't think anybody will ever ask you about this table, all right? But you could just read about it so that you have it at the back of your head. Maybe it might help you somewhere, okay? So these guys, I think this is our classification on neurons in excitable tissues, okay? So we also classify neurons in neurophysiology 1, also in neurobiochemistry, okay? So each area has the way it's classifying neurons, okay? So see you guys in the next tutorial and bye for now.